Ooh. Hello, YouTubers! My name's Willie. Welcome to my channel. Today I've got another Siege of Vraks video for you. Request reaction video 105. The Thunder of Krieg lands on Vraks. This is a Arch Warhammer video and has been requested by Death Grips and CJ Falcon. So, yeah, let's check it out. I am trying a different style of reaction. That's where over here on this side of the screen is me, and then over here will be the video. On videos where there's a lot that happens, it means that I won't have the little bubble in the way, and you'll actually be able to see me. I won't have to be all up in the screen. So I thought might as well try it. I've got the capability now. Some upgrades to my system. But anyways, let's get started. Play. Dun dun. Dun dun. Dun dun dun.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Siege of Vraks, the third episode, where we're finally going to get into some real action with the opening battles of the Siege of Vraks. The Imperium's response has been made absolutely manifest, and the Death Corps of Krieg has arrived on Vraks in considerable strength. The first thing they would do was to land on the planet, as we talked about previously, and fortify a small area, upon which they would build a series of improvised starports. These would be nothing like the massive industrial complexes of a proper starport, but for now it would serve the Death Corps' need in establishing a base of logistics and then further front lines from which the attack upon Vraks' outer defences could be launched. Luckily for the poor sods in the Death Corps, they were not expected to build all of it. The Adeptus Administratum had brought along with them a 1,000,000-man strong labour corps, whose primary and first duty was the construction of the improvised starport, whilst under the protection of the Death Corps of Krieg. Once this was done, the secondary task was the construction of massive rail yards,
I wish I was under
which would then be used by gargantuan Adeptus Mechanicus trains to haul the vast quantities of ammunitions and other supplies needed up to the forward lines. And speaking of said lines, let's have a look at how the 88th Siege Army had been deployed. Obviously, since their objective was to lay siege to Vraks, their deployment plan was primarily influenced by the location and strength of the Vraksian defenses. And they were excessive, would perhaps be the correct word. Over Vraks' many-year history, their fortifications had spread and spread and spread, until finally, this battlefield would cover some 5,000 square kilometers. And primarily, the Vraksian defenses were organized into 3 defensive lines. The first and outer defensive line, the middle and inner defensive line, and finally, the third inner defensive line, the Red Line, which included the Vraksian citadel itself, where the apostate cardinal was currently residing. Once the 88th Siege Army was entrenched outside this line, the primary citadel would be within range of their heavy artillery, and at that point, there would be very little hope of Vraks ever resisting the Imperium's advance. The only question then was how to actually reach said third and final red line. and the Imperium was sadly somewhat limited in their options. They could not flank around to the south as that terrain was covered in deep, damn near unbridgeable gorges, and was, for all intents and purposes, untraversable by the 88th Siege Army.
Oh,
Now,
okay,
there
so
was
that's
one
why.
area that might facilitate a large-scale landing operation that was also defended by the 2nd Defensive Line. Krieg High Command briefly considered landing a force here and making a go for the 2nd line, therefore potentially circumventing the 1st line of defenses, but this was on a fairly small peninsula, surrounded by deep canyons on practically all sides. Any large-scale landing here would have to be continuously supported and supplied directly from orbit, without the benefit of a logistical line or supply depots.
Yeah.
This would severely limit the size of the force that could be dropped on this smaller peninsula. This in return meant that their attack upon the 2nd defensive line would be considerably weaker, and to make things even worse, seeing as they would be almost completely surrounded by impassable terrain, it would be virtually impossible for the rest of the 88th Siege Army to send any aid if this formation was put under threat. Meanwhile, the Vraksians could easily transport vast quantities of troops from any of the other defensive zones. It was quickly decided that the risks of launching an attack from this direction were simply too great in comparison to the potential benefits. And
Makes
since
sense,
an all-out
makes
striking at
sense.
the Vraksian starport to the east had been considered, and also rejected, that meant that options for fanciful maneuvering had more or less been exhausted. Luckily, this wasn't really considered to be all that much of a bad thing as far as the Death Corps was concerned. Instead, they had formulated a simple, yet reliable plan. First and foremost, the Vraksian defences were to be encircled by the 88th Siege Army as far as the terrain allowed. Then, once the encirclement was established, the Siege Army would begin localized offensives whilst continuously threatening the entirety of the Vraksian front line.
Wow.
The logic here was quite simple. The 88th Siege Army knew that in all due likelihood they would be outnumbering the defenders of Vraks, which they still assumed to consist of a few 100,000, maybe 1 or 2 million at the absolute most. However, the Siege Army had one massive advantage. They were on the offensive. They could simply encircle the Vraksian defenses, create their own defensive lines, and threaten any and all points along the Vraksian defenses. This meant that the Vraksians had to defend every single location simultaneously, spreading their fairly limited manpower resources across a vast area. Meanwhile, the Imperial Guard could easily afford to match the Vraksian defenders on the defensive, whilst also gathering up vastly superior forces for localized breakthroughs. And once the breakthrough was achieved, the 88th Siege Army's assault corps would begin pouring through the gap. And once this process had begun, it was expected that the only choice open to the Vraksian defenders would be to fall back from what remained of their first defensive line to attempt to reinforce the second. A failure to initiate such a withdrawal would leave the Vraksian defenders facing enemies to their front, to their flank, and to their rear, unquestionably sealing their fate and any possibility of further withdrawal. In conventional military thinking, there would also be a second option for the defenders, and that would be a large-scale localized counterattack utilizing any and all reserves of a motorized, mechanized, or tank variety, including any and all super heavy weapons that the defenders might be in possession of. The goal of this operation would be to attack, disrupt, and potentially even destroy the Imperial spearhead, with the goal of then carrying on past the assault corps into the breach and the defensive line, clearing out any remaining Imperial Guard elements within the breach, resealing it, and potentially even carrying out a rapid riposte into the Imperial rear lines. Such a counterattack, if carried out expertly and with the correct timing, could potentially be absolutely devastating, since the Imperial Siege Army would in all due likelihood be in the process of picking up their own heavy weapons, reserves and logistical elements, and begin moving them forwards to what was once the enemy's forward lines, so that they could start digging in again and beginning the siege of the second defensive line. If the enemy counterattack catches these troops in the midst of transporting their heavy weaponry, they would essentially be caught flat-footed into the open with virtually nothing in the way of prepared defenses. However, on Vraks, the risk of such a counterattack was considered to be very, very low, virtually entirely negligible in fact, since the majority of the defenders would at best be ex-PDF troops. And the Death Corps High Command did not believe that such troops had the training, experience, or command structure necessary to organize such an endeavor. At worst, they reckoned they might be faced with smaller, localized, regimental-sized counterattacks, which a full Krieg assault corps should have no problems crushing beneath their tracks.
Oh, jeez.
And so with that worry out of the way,
Just
the
crushed
plan
them all.
itself was quite simple. Firstly, the 88th Siege Army would deploy in a semi-encirclement of the outer defensive line. This line was to be overrun quickly. Therefore, large-scale artillery bombardments would be aimed at what they assumed to be weak points in the line, and then the Krieg soldiers would simply be hurled at these weak points until they finally gave way, after which the assault corps would swiftly punch through the weakened breaches and begin their advance upon the second line of defenses. This offensive would then also lead to the collapse of the outer line, which in turn would allow the 88th Siege Army to move forwards and initiate a proper encirclement of Vraks' second line. This advance would also cut 2 of the 3 primary connections leading from the Vraksian starport to the Vraksian citadel. The defenders were not expected to receive any form of reinforcement off-world. The Imperial Navy was going to make sure of that, but this could allow the 88th Siege Army to begin an offensive against the starport itself, possibly taking it over, or at the very least leaving it as nothing more than a burning ruin. This was, however, very much so a secondary, if not perhaps even a tertiary objective, since at this point the 88th Siege Army would be fully supplied from their own improvised starports. The capture of the full industrialized Vraksian starport would be a nice bonus, but it was not necessary, and considering the inherent defensibility of said installation, that might be for the best. The starport was located on the other side of a series of massive canyons, spanned by prefabricated bridges, and the capture of said installation would literally require the Death Corps to march across aforementioned bridges with practically nothing in the way of cover for up to several kilometers. And whilst the Death Corps never shirks from doing what must be done, there is a difference between sacrifice and suicide. Once the siege army was entrenched along the second line, they could then begin to take their time. The numerical advantage they had already enjoyed at the first line would now have been considerably increased by the fact that the front line had been yet further shortened, allowing the 88th Siege Army to concentrate even more guns, even more manpower, and even more tanks in an even smaller area. And this was where the majority of the 12-year projected period of the siege would take place, as the 88th Siege Army simply pounded every single last defensive fortification into the ground, one by one, line by line, bunker by bunker, trench by trench, until nothing was left standing. And after literally years of heavy bombardment and probing attacks, the weakest points along the lines would have been identified, and a slow, grinding advance would then begin, with the aim of completely destroying the second defensive line. This offensive operation was expected to be conducted with minimal in the way of casualties due to the amount of time the 88th Siege Army expected to have to reduce the enemy's defenses. And when they finally crumbled, the last, final part of the operation could begin. The 88th Siege Army would advance up until the very innermost defenses of the curtain walls of the keep itself. At this point, the Vraksian citadel and all remaining traitor forces on Vraks would be within range of the heavy Krieg artillery, and at this point, there really wasn't much left for the defenders to do. They would be outnumbered, penned into a tiny comparative area, under constant artillery bombardment from all directions without the ability to move up reserves, reinforcements, supply, or anything else that really mattered. When finally encamped outside the last line of defense, the war was as good as over. Another year, maybe two, of consistent artillery bombardment and the occasional infantry probing attack to discover the remaining weak points in the enemy's defenses, and then these could be subsequently overrun by massed formations of Imperial army.
Yeah.
It certainly wasn't the most subtle, or the most nuanced, or the most complex plan ever devised by Imperial Guard commanders, but it didn't have to be. The Death Corps sat with all of the advantages. They had the initiative, they had the manpower, they had the material, and all they needed to do was grind away at a static enemy in known defensive positions until there was nothing more to grind away at. Exactly the kind of fight that the Death Corps was created for. So, it was all a done deal then. All that's left now is to wait for the inevitable outcome. Or was it? I guess we'll see. Because as the old saying goes, even a journey of a million miles starts with a single step.
So I guess we'll see.
In this case, the first step was already well underway. The establishment of the vast logistical network required to support the 88th Siege Army in the field. This process was to take a full year, and when it was finally completed, the initial offensive operations could begin. The first step was, of course, for the Krieg regiments to begin establishing their own front line, a safe forward base of operation from which they could launch offensive operations and fall back as needed. And the first step in doing this was to divide the total front line up amongst the available corps. In this case, specifically the Line Corps, with the 34th Corps being tasked with advancing upon the Vraksian defences from the south across the plains of Saramita, the 12th Corps advancing across the Van Meersland's wastes, the 30th Corps advancing towards the Sorin Depression, and finally the 1st Corps swinging around to the north, advancing towards the Chalia Plateau and beginning an attack against the Vraksian northern defences, which were partially incomplete. Although, mind you, I said they started their advance at this point, and whilst that is technically true, this first offensive was to be relatively bloodless. The Krieg heavy artillery was, of course, to play their own special music of destruction, but the infantry was not expected to advance into combat on this first offensive operation. Rather, their job was to advance slowly and steadily into the area that had been getting plastered by the artillery. Once again, Krieg is fond of sacrifice, not suicide. The intention of this first heavy walking barrage was to provide the Krieg troopers with plenty of makeshift cover in the form of shell holes. Once the Krieg troopers had reached this area, they would then begin moving forward slowly until they came under heavy and concentrated fire. Then they would begin digging in and preparing the foundation for their own defensive line. On the first night, this defensive line would consist of simple foxholes, 2 men per hole. Then, over the next few days, they would begin expanding this simple defensive line, with each man occupying the foxhole, digging in opposite directions to connect their foxhole to the foxholes next to them. Over the course of just a day or two, what started out as a large collection of individual shelters will have evolved into a makeshift front line. At this point, heavy weapons will be brought forward and put into positions. Additionally, light engineering vehicles will also move forward to help expand the front line and create further dugouts, reinforced embankments, and shelters. When these operations are complete, the front line is considered to be relatively secure against any kind of rapid push by the enemy. This then makes it safe enough to begin work on the second front line. This will be the main series of defences to ensure that the enemy cannot break out of the encirclement even with a coordinated effort, and as such it will be considerably more ambitious. This is also the reason why this line is created second, as it will require a fair bit of time to create and will also need quite a bit of specialist equipment that needs protecting from enemy heavy weapons fire and the occasional raid. Once this line is complete, it will boast several permacrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, alongside a full trench system connecting them to one another and the various other defensive emplacements. It will also include reinforced permacrete positions for vehicles to go hull down in, and may even have dedicated defensive bunkers equipped with improvised armoured turrets. In the case of the siege on Vraks, this would most likely be the turrets of Leman Russ main battle tanks or chimeras. The second line will also be the home of several batteries of light artillery, like mortars and heavy quad launchers. And of course, even whilst this line is being constructed, the first line is being expanded upon with the creation of additional dugouts, communications trenches, forward ammo depots, emergency medical stations, dummy trenches, and of course offensive saps heading towards the enemy's
This is
line.
amazing.
Behind this line again, we have a third line. These positions have already been under construction for quite some time. These were once the same sort of improvised positions that are even now under construction at the first line. They were originally created as a safety measure against the theorized large-scale counterattack that Imperial commanders thought the Vraksians might try in the early days of the invasion. Now, however, with the new front line firmly established, this line has been turned primarily into an artillery and command line. It does also serve as a final line of defense in emergencies and is appropriately fortified, but most of this line's defenses is of a slightly different nature. Massive prefabricated reinforced bunkers for command staff and logistical officers, along with vast underground storage depots and countless prepared positions for artillery batteries, including camouflage, earthworks, their own armoured ammunition depots and dummy positions. There would also be several trenches extending out from this line into forward sentry positions and countless observation stations, both to record and correct fire missions and to provide security against infiltration, as the huge ammo depots would be supremely tempting targets for any Vraksian traitor that somehow got all the way back here. The odds of such a deep infiltration are of course infinitesimally small, but the potential consequences of such a winning lottery ticket means that it was best to not take any chances. And speaking of copious quantities of explosives, all those grenades must of course come from somewhere, and in this case, that somewhere is Krieg itself. Krieg produces not only fighting men, but also the weapons and equipment to arm those men. This wide variety of supplies and ammunition are transported to Vraks under Imperial Navy escort on massive bulk freighters. These transports can carry dozens of megatons of supplies and can take months just to load and unload, and even longer on these somewhat improvised facilities on Vraks. This means that whilst there's only ever a few transports in system at any one time, there is continuous traffic back and forth from the surface and said ships. To facilitate this transport, large numbers of improvised starports, along with storage facilities and rail transport yards, have been constructed in a miniature city of logistics. It is connected to the third line by several permacrete highways and rail lines operated by the Mechanicus. Naturally, this logistical line is also defended, in a fashion, but primarily against enemy air raids, and Vraks had no real air force to speak of, and so it was lightly defended. It may in fact be better to say that this line was policed and guarded, rather than necessarily defended. Besides, if an enemy attack was strong enough to reach all the way back here, odds are good that the shit had well and truly hit the fan quite some time ago.
Yeah.
Now then, this gives us a general outlay of the current disposition of the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army at the start of offensive operations. The first line serving as an initial line of defense and as a springboard for offensive operations via the construction of offensive saps and covered rallying points have been constructed, and will be considerably expanded upon as operations continue. The second line is more heavily defended and acts as a sort of safety line. It also houses the artillery and forward supply depots, along with various other logistical services, including maintenance and repair yards.
This is just...
It is also where the heavy assets are stored whilst waiting for the Great Breakthrough. The tanks, APCs, and armoured fist formations sheltering in bunkers and rear line trenches. Relatively safe from enemy artillery and still close enough to the front line to be swiftly put into action. And finally, of course, the logistical line, where all the toys required to wage war are brought down from orbit, stored, and finally transported to the sharp end. With everything in place, the party could finally get started, and the 149th Regiment of the 12th Line Corps was granted the honor of being the first Krieg formation to officially assault the Vraksian first line of defenses. And the location chosen for the attack was Sector 4639. This sector was chosen because, as far as the Imperium knew, this being knowledge gathered before the fall of Vraks, mind you, this sector was still under construction. Therefore, High Command theorized that it might provide the 88th Siege Army with the quick, decisive breakthrough of the first line of defenses that their long-term plan relied upon. To facilitate this rapid breakthrough, the 149th Regiment would also be aided by two further regiments, the 143rd to their immediate left, and the 150th to their immediate right flank. These two regiments were primarily tasked with launching diversionary attacks to the left and right of the primary attack being launched by the 149th, thusly preventing Vraksian reinforcements to all gather in on the 149th attack. As a secondary objective, the 143rd and the 150th were also to begin mapping and evaluation of the enemy's front lines. Imperial High Command was painfully aware of the fact that their information was quite outdated at this point, and they had to assume that the rebels had been carrying out potentially extensive reworking and reinforcing of the forward lines, which might mean that the designated weak point, which the 149th Regiment was going to focus on, might not be a weak point at all. And, depending on further data, it might be better to shift the focus of the offensive to the 143rd or the 150th. But regardless of which regiment finally managed to gain a foothold in the defensive line, they would require a reserve force to punch through and create the rapid breakthrough necessary to force the enemy to abandon the first defensive line and retreat back to the second. This was the task of the 11th Assault Corps, which was brought up to reinforce the 143rd, 149th, and 150th. The Assault Corps was only to be deployed in one out of two situations. The first and most hopeful was that the leading infantry regiments had managed to create a breakthrough wide enough for the Lehman Russ and Armoured Fist elements of the 11th to burst through and threaten the enemy's second line. The other possibility was that the leading infantry regiments had managed to establish a solid enough foothold, but not quite managed to break entirely through the defensive line, in which situation the 11th Assault Corps might be brought up, and their Gorgon Heavy Assault Transport and Lehman Russ squadrons would be the final blow to break through the enemy's line, and then continue onwards to threaten the second line.
Roadkill.
And to make it easier for the infantry to achieve the breakthrough, or at the very least the foothold, they were also assisted by the 21st Bombardment Corps, whose 6,500 heavy guns would have been bombarding the enemy's defensive lines for close to a week before the general start of the offensive. And so, at 21:28:13 millennia 41, a lonely green flare arched skywards from the Krieg trench line, joined moments later by hundreds of similar flares as 3 full regiments of Krieg guardsmen rose from their trenches and began their long march across no man's land. Along with the rise of the flares and several kilometers back, 6,500 heavy guns raised their barrels incrementally and began bombarding the Vraksian rear lines, cutting off the forward positions from reinforcements. And simultaneously with this, several thousand light artillery pieces attached to the 3 siege infantry regiments refocused their fire as well, changing from a general saturation barrage to home in on identified centers of resistance that were not expected to be broken through in the first infantry assault, large-scale bunker complexes or individual bunkers in advantageous positions. These would be kept under continuous light artillery fire in an attempt to either completely neutralize them or at the very least make the occupants of said positions be highly skeptical of poking their heads out. Now, let's talk a little bit about how such an attack might actually be carried out, since the Krieg Death Corps has a fairly peculiar way of doing
An
things.
interesting
As
style,
mentioned,
yes.
they prefer attacking fortified positions in waves, with the first wave being expected to achieve, well, essentially nothing in all due reality. They will rise from their own trenches, advance across no man's land, and attack the enemy's positions. They won't be quite so crazy as to do this in single line, like certain nations during our own First World War, but in all due essentiality, this is more or less completely uncovered infantry advancing across the open with relatively little in the way of support. They will of course be bringing along their own heavy weapons in the form of autocannons, heavy bolters, and infantry-carried weapons like the occasional flamer or grenade launcher, but they're not going to be bringing along anything particularly heavy, like tanks or armored vehicles. And the reason for this is that they are not there to break the enemy's defenses. Hell, they're barely even there to really make a dent in the enemy's defenses. Their primary purpose is to wander fairly close to the enemy defenses and then figure out roughly where the most of them are dying the quickest. And no, I'm not kidding, that is literally their job. And that might at first seem just a tiny bit pointless. It might even, God Emperor help you, seem like a waste of manpower, but no, of course not. There is actually a reason why they're doing this. It is essentially a form of battlefield intelligence. The commanders can get the information on how quickly their men are dying in a certain sector and decide, well, this is probably a bad place to attack, whilst over here, they're dying 50% slower, meaning that that must be a way easier place to attack. It might not be the most nuanced, subtle, or indeed caring of, well, information-gathering operations, but it is effective. And it does achieve its objective, which is essentially to make sure that the second, the third, the fourth, and etc. waves have an actual chance of achieving what they're there to do. Since if they were to send in the real assault first, odds are good that they would suffer heavy casualties from amongst their actually valuable troops. The grenadiers, the combat engineers, the tanks and the gorgons, rather than amongst the infantry, whom the Krieg Officer Corps consider to be barely worth more than the ammunition they expend. Though, with all that being said, don't get me wrong, they aren't just throwing them at the enemy lines willy-nilly. Or, well, no, actually they are, but it's not quite as cold-hearted as it might first sound. You see, it takes a lot of planning and preparation to orchestrate the wholesale slaughter of one's own men, and actually get something useful out of it. As mentioned, the primary purpose of the first wave assault is intelligence, but of course any and all actual progress would be a very welcome bonus, and so everything is done to ensure the men in the first wave have all the support they can expect. Or, well, all the support they can expect to fulfill their limited objectives, at least. And I think in fact it would be better if we made a clear distinction here. The first wave isn't really an assault at all, and to be perfectly clear, it is not how the Death Corps prefers to do things. If the 88th Army had more time on their hands, as they were planning to have against the second defensive line, this offensive probing, the scouting, would be carried out over the course of weeks, maybe even months, with small-scale raids on enemy lines launched from carefully prepared positions with offensive saps, which, by the way, I should probably explain what is. An offensive sap is essentially a trench that is dug towards the enemy. This can be as simple or as complex as you like. It could, for example, be just a simple trench zigzagging towards the enemy line so as to prevent the enemy from being able to simply shoot straight down the entirety of the line, or it could be a fairly complex structure, perhaps dug underground, for example, to reinforce the sap and also provide concealment for the troops moving through it. And the obvious benefits of an offensive sap is that it shortens the distance that the poor old infantryman has to walk across no man's land before reaching the enemy's trenches, which, while still not being exactly a welcoming and friendly territory, is still considerably safer than wandering across no man's land without cover. And in an ideal scenario, the 88th Siege Army would take weeks, again possibly even months, to construct a vast and elaborate network of offensive saps from which they could launch raiding parties upon the enemy's front line. This way, they could not only discover which parts were more heavily defended, they could also work away at the enemy's defenses. Doing such things as capturing single bunkers and destroying them with demolition charges, or destroying parts of their trench lines, or even identifying points of interest within the enemy's own defenses. For example, dugouts, or ammo storage facilities, or rallying points, mortar pits, etc. Anything and everything that can be identified, located, and then lovingly targeted by vast quantities of artillery. However, these were not the ideal circumstances. The high and mighty upper brass of the 88th Siege Army had decided that the first defensive line was to be broken through swiftly, and damn the costs. Thusly, the Krieg Death Corps had to utilize a more direct way of gathering the intelligence they needed, and that is why they are currently throwing hundreds of thousands of men straight up against the enemy's defenses. Again, they do support them insofar as they can, this being a limited mission, with a preparatory barrage of heavy artillery, the shifting of said artillery barrage to hinder enemy reinforcements, and the targeting of what the army thinks are points of interests. Again, they haven't actually been able to identify any, but, you know, best guess and all that. And of course, along with the casualty figures, also rise the certainty about which points are actually interesting, meaning that the light artillery and also the heavy weapons can eventually shift their fire from the points that have perhaps been proven to be not that dangerous at all, and over to the points that are actively murdering vast quantities of Krieg's guardsmen. After a few hours of this unremittent slaughter, the first wave will in all due likelihood have been more or less completely repulsed, at which point the second wave will have adjusted its objectives and points of attack. They will, for example, be sent in against areas where they would require more intelligence, where they too will be dying in prolific quantities, and they might also be starting to head towards areas that High Command might think could be weak points, so as to actually determine whether or not it is a weak point, or if it was simply just a heavy machine gun emplacement that the higher-ups hadn't correctly identified yet. And to the great misfortune of the second wave, in the vast majority of cases it turned out to be the latter option. Just imagine being one of these poor little guardsmen. You get to go up into no man's land, where you will face a hail of incoming heavy bolter fire, stubber fire, light and heavy artillery with precisely zero cover, and you don't even get to tell yourself that you're doing this for something approaching an actual point or purpose. Rather, you are doing this so that somebody, somewhere, further to the rear, can just put a line through your serial number and go, yeah, that doesn't work either. But at the end of the day, we must all suffer what we must. The poor Imperial Guardsman needs to suffer wandering across no man's land with, again, precisely zero cover, whilst several thousand angry traitors hose his general position down with all manners of automatic weaponry, whilst the poor clergyman at the rear suffers the trials and tribulations of repetitive stress injuries to his wrist from crossing out so many serial numbers. And perhaps the absolute worst part of it all was that when night finally fell and the attacks on the first day were called off, and as the miserable wounded crawled their way back across no man's land and into friendly trenches, the only readily apparent gain from a whole day's worth of fighting and the heroic sacrifices of innumerable guardsmen could be summed up in a single report.
Nice.
The assumption that the traitors' lines would be incomplete or still under construction would appear to be incorrect. And as if to highlight the lunacy, and just to make absolutely sure that this second assumption, the one that the traitor lines were indeed completed, Krieg High Command ordered that the offensive would continue for a second day.
Wow.
And so a third, and eventually a fourth wave of infantry was sent across the top and towards the enemy's trenches. whereupon the way they met pretty much
Huh.
exactly the same fate as the first and second wave before them. After 2 days of continuous combat and tens of thousands of casualties, the only worthwhile piece of information to be gleaned from atop this veritable mountain of corpses, was that, yes, the traitor lines have in fact been completed, and if anything, they appear to be even stronger than the surrounding sectors. And luckily, the Vraxian traitors also saw fit to furnish Imperial High Command with one further piece of information, so as to not let the last 2 days be entirely pointless. They launched a large-scale, mechanized offensive upon the Krieg trenches, utilizing considerable quantities of Chimera armored transports, no doubt looted from the storage facilities beneath the planet. The counterattack came as a complete surprise for the Krieg guardsmen, who after 2 days of fighting had just made it back to their own trenches the previous day. They were still somewhat disorganized and certainly far from full strength. However, they did have one advantage, and that, ironically enough, was that their previous assaults had achieved virtually nothing, and so practically all of their heavy weapons were still in their pre-planned positions. This meant that the Vraxian counterattack was met with an absolute deluge of heavy weapons fire. Heavy bolters, autocannons, rocket launchers, heavy quad launchers, Earthshaker, and Medusa artillery, along, of course, with all of the small arms weapons that the Krieg regiments could muster. Along pretty much all the front line, the Vraxians met the exact same fate as the Krieg's guardsmen had, except, along with the Vraxians, a considerable quantity of Chimera transports were also burning happily in no man's land. Though, to be fair to the traitors, they had far more in the way of lightly armored vehicles like the Chimeras than they really had men, and so for them to waste a large quantity of IFVs in the hope that it would get them a bit closer to the enemy wasn't really all that much of a sacrifice. Whilst in contrast, for the Krieg side of things, if they were to lose an equally large quantity of armored transports, it would be far more of a setback, since they would have to have any replacements shipped in all the way from Krieg. And the mechanized elements did provide the traitors with a fair bit of an advantage, allowing them to do what the Death Corps had not managed, and actually break into the opposition's trench line. At trench R462-3892, 3 platoons of the 15th Company from the 143rd Regiment were engaged by a mass of enemy armor as their requests for artillery went unanswered, be it due to the fact that no artillery support was available or due to the fact that their lines of communications had been severed. Regardless of which it was, the platoons holding the trench line did not receive heavy artillery support, and so the mechanized elements of the Vraxians not only reached their lines, but also managed to fight their way into them and gain control of the trenches. However, when they began trying to push into the neighboring sections of the line, they were met with stubborn resistance. And this time, the Krieg lines of communications were fully functioning. A further request for artillery support brought down a veritable storm of Earthshaker artillery, which completely and utterly obliterated the old Krieg trench line, along with their new traitorous occupants. Along the rest of the Krieg trench lines, despite the somewhat sparsely occupied trenches, the sheer concentration of heavy weapons along with artillery support was able to stymie the traitorous advance. And when night fell again on the 3rd day, the traitors gave up any further attempts at breaking through. They had still managed to get further than the Krieg regiments had by capturing and for a short time actually holding on to a piece of the enemy's trenches. But at the end of the 3-day battle, neither side had really achieved anything significant, and neither side had come anywhere even remotely close to something resembling a breakthrough. The probing had, though, served its purpose. Costly as it might be, they had managed to determine that this portion of the front line was not going to provide them with the quick and easy breakthrough that they required. They had also learned that the enemy was in possession of considerable quantities of lightly armored vehicles, something that had already been theorized by Imperial High Command, but they had simply assumed that the enemy would lack the coordination required to actually launch a large-scale and simultaneous mechanized offensive. This would appear to be a false assumption, though the attack had not been necessarily the most organized in nature. They had, however, been able to launch it along the entirety of the sector at more or less the same time. The traitors had also demonstrated that they were fully able to operate as armored fist formations. Perhaps not quite up to the standards of the Imperial Guard, certainly, but nevertheless, this was a lesson that Imperial High Command would do well to remember. Unfortunately, it was largely dismissed at the time. It was said that, of course, even untrained troops could simply line up a number of vehicles and drive straight across no man's land. This did not require any great deal of coordination or command, and so nothing was really done with the information. It was, almost in its entirety, dismissed. What was considerably harder to dismiss, however, was that a full 3-regiment assault had failed to break through the enemy's front line. This came as a bit of a shock to Imperial High Command, and once the information was eventually relayed all the way up to the Lord Commander himself, it created a bit of an impasse. The rapid and easy breakthrough that had been expected and almost taken for granted had not materialized. What then was to be done next? Well, for the time being, the answer to that question was nothing.
Nothing.
Julka's command staff had no ready-made and formulated answer to this particular problem. They, along with everyone else, had simply assumed that the offensive would be a success. They were attacking a weakened portion of the front line, and they were fighting mere rebels, untrained savages, essentially. And despite that, not only had they not broken through the enemy's line, they had made, quite literally, no progress whatsoever. And presumably the Lord General's office did not issue any further directives at that point in time, since the 88th Siege Army simply settled down and went back into a more comfortable and familiar doctrine. The Krieg doctrine of fortifying the entirety of their own front line and starting to wear down the enemy. Offensive saps were constructed all along the front line, from which numerous raids and patrols could be launched into no man's land and into the enemy's trench system. These mini-attacks had two general goals: to gather yet further information about the enemy's positions and to start to wear away at them, with the destruction of individual bunkers or strongpoints, or the collapsing of enemy offensive saps, the killing of their personnel, the destruction of heavy weapons, and occasionally the abduction of a traitor or two to figure out the rough strength of the enemy they were facing. The Krieg combat engineers were also extremely busy in this period, as they were carrying out a duel against their opposite number on the Vraksian side. The Krieg engineers would exit into no man's land, usually during the hours of darkness, and try to locate enemy minefields, possibly removing them or even relaying them in ways to annoy the enemy. Additionally, they would also move further towards the enemy's front lines and begin cutting secret paths through their barbed wire to open safe routes for Krieg raids on the enemy's trenches. And of course, whilst the Krieg engineers were doing this, their Vraksian counterparts were also doing the exact same thing, and so no man's land was frequently lit up by small arms fire when the various patrols stumbled into one another. And far, far above their heads, another form of duel was also taking place. Both sides had thousands upon thousands of heavy artillery pieces straddling the divide of no man's land, continuously shelling one another's positions, each other's trench lines, and occasionally dropping a shell or two out in no man's land. After all, you never know when you'd get lucky and catch a particularly unfortunate patrol with a high explosive shrapnel round, a quick drumfire barrage, or even the occasional starfire shell. This quote-unquote quiet period would continue on for the rest of the year, and although, again, it was a quiet period, quote-unquote, everything is most definitively relative. Even during the periods in which neither side were conducting any offensive operations, even raids, the Krieg Death Corps was losing on average 2,000 guardsmen
2,000
every
guardsmen?
single day. From infection, from random enemy artillery, from sniper fire, from disease, from poison gas attacks, etc., etc., etc. Undoubtedly, life wasn't exactly a life on roses on the Vraxian side either, but they at least had the advantage of pre-made defensive positions to take a lot of the edge off things like harassing enemy artillery fire and also the gas attacks. The Krieg regiments were of course experts of dealing with hostile terrain, but no matter how good your gas filter is, it'll never be quite as good as a fully sealed bunker complex. Nevertheless, occasionally a nice big fat shell will get lucky and find an enemy dugout. Maybe it will damage a vent on a bunker, allowing poison gas to seep in. Maybe a raid will get lucky and enter into the Vraxian trenches and inflict casualties there, so on and so on and so on. The simple fact was that if this fully devolved into a battle of attrition, the Imperium's victory was essentially guaranteed, since any and all casualties suffered by the Death Corps had already been anticipated and planned for, with a constant stream of reinforcements being pumped into the 88th Siege Army every single day. This fact, along with the apparent inevitability of an Imperial victory, might explain the inactivity of Imperial General Headquarters for the rest of the year. After the failure of their original plan, HQ seemed content to simply let the Krieg officers carry on with their own plans for grinding down the enemy.
Gave
and
the
as far
steering
as the
wheel
Krieg
over
commanders
to
were
the
concerned,
actual soldiers.
that was just peachy. They would continue to attack the entirety of the Vraxian front lines until something, somewhere, broke. And so the second year of the siege, the first year of official offensive operations, came to an end. And with them also this video. If you liked it, please do consider sharing it around to friends and other people who might be interested. Until next time,
thank you, Arch.
Thank you very much so for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.
Okay, so that was Arch Warhammer's Siege of Vraks. The Thunder of Krieg lands on Vraks. This was requested by Death Grips and CJ Falcon. So, my thoughts on it. It's an amazing look at the beginning of wartime for the siege. There was amazing detail and maps and the concept, what they thought the war would be, and of course we're getting something awesome, something completely different than they expected. Yeah, so actually it's very intriguing, and I can't wait to see what's next. If you aren't watching Arch Warhammer's videos, why aren't you? There's a link in the description, so go check it out. Well, that's pretty much what I got to say. So, Willie, out.
If you like the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to comment. Have a good one.